we have a great opportunity to go deep. These are, in fact, deep dive sessions. They're relatively new to the Aspen Institute. We started them last summer at Ideas Festival. And it's a chance to go get a little richer learning and to hear about great work. And so my job is to keep it moving, to keep our incredible leaders and the whole host of great folks who are going to be part of this session front and center for you all to learn about great work happening out there. And I would say, so let me give you the framework for the day. Nick Turner's going to come up in about 45 seconds and give us a framework for the culture, the context of this moment around mass incarceration, around not only just rethinking prisons as the title for this session describes it, but also in many ways, how do we move rethinking justice, rethinking community, rethinking opportunity. So Nick's going to frame that up 15, 20 minutes. Then we're going to do 2 rapid fire panels. We're going to hold questions. We're going to have some awkward moments of mic changes and, do I clip it to my belt? Those kinds of things. Bear with us. I'll have a few opportunities to exchange with you, the audience, as we transition from one panel to the next. 2 quick rapid fire panels, and then we'll hold questions for the end. So when Doug Wood from the Ford Foundation says something really powerful on the first panel, hold it until we get to the end. And hopefully we'll get you out of here right on time for John Kerry and others this afternoon. So I'm not going to say anything else as an introduction, except that when you think about being the privilege of working at the Aspen Institute, you can pretty much invite anybody to come and speak, and they usually will say yes. So when we thought about the best person on the planet, the most dedicated change agent to frame this up for this work, it was a no-brainer to invite Nick Turner, the president of the Vera Institute of Justice, an organization that's been leading the charge on justice reform for how many decades now? 5.5 decades. So I'm going to ask Nick to come up, frame this up, and then we'll bring our first panel up right afterwards. Nick, thank you for being here. Woo!
Wow, lots of hyperbole in this room, clearly. Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate that. Don't sit in my seat. So, don't sit in my seat. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get started. As Steve said, I'm going to frame things up and just try to paint the big picture and tell you a little bit about, think of it as the dime tour of mass incarceration. So what do we mean when we say mass incarceration? How did we get here? Are we unique as a country when we compare ourselves to peers, and what is to be done and whether we have a moment of opportunity for reform? But before I go through that dime tour, which is going to be quick, it's going to be with a lot of statistics and a bit of history. What I'd like to do is have us begin by looking at a short video. So let's roll that video, and then I'll explain why you're watching it.
Dear Dad,
it's been 8 years since I saw you last.
I want to express myself to you. I haven't done it in a long time.
I just wanted to tell you how much I love and miss you. It's been really hard growing up without a father for so much of my life.
When you come home, Dad, I want...
I want you to see me graduate next year.
Going to attend college in the fall.
I got elected for school to go to a baseball game and throw out the first pitch.
I can't wait for you to be out here and for us to try to make up the past 13 years.
First thing I want to do with you when you get home is play basketball. I just want to hang out and talk to you.
Hearing your motorcycle, I miss that. So like when I hear other motorcycles come down the street, it's like,
Happy Father's Day, Dad.
Happy Father's Day.
Happy Father's Day, Dad. Happy Father's Day, Dad.
Your one and only baby girl.
I always forget about how that affects me. The reason for showing you all of that is that we have to bear in mind when we talk about mass incarceration, and we occasionally get lost in the numbers and the politics around it. We have to bear in mind the human cost. And too often in this country, we have not thought about that human cost at all, and we've thought about others who are locked up behind bars, and we haven't thought about the impact on them or the impact on their children or on their families and on their communities. So while I am the head of a research organization, a think and do tank, the most important thing that I think is required of us all in order to address mass incarceration is empathy. As Brian Stevenson says, getting proximate. And so this video, which was actually produced by Google and YouTube and released for Father's Day, there's a similar one for Mother's Day, is one attempt to do that. So what are we talking about here? What is mass incarceration? I will throw a bunch of numbers out at you. I apologize for the litany, but I really am trying to just move through this quickly. 2.2 million people behind bars in this country. That's both in jails and prisons. For those of you who don't know, jails are local lockups. Those are places where you end up going after you've been arrested and you are awaiting trial, or where you might stay if you have been sentenced for less than a year. There are about 700,000 people in jail. Of that 2.2 million, the remainder of the 2.2 million are in prison, and most of those are in state facilities. And that's a very important thing to understand, because we're not talking about one system. We're actually talking about systems that are controlled by thousands of counties and then by 50 states. To give you a sense of the magnitude, on any given year, there are 12 million admissions in this country into jail. So that doesn't necessarily mean that 12 million unique individuals walk into jail, because it turns out that a few people cycle through. But that is a huge number. It is bigger than the population of New York by 3 million. And people enter into a system that I would say is rooted in theories of incapacitation. So we want to put you away, keep you locked up so that you're not harming the community. Rooted in theories of punishment and vindictiveness, and probably at best marginally resourced to make people better, to help them succeed when they come out. And that's a really important thing, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that in the panel today, because almost everyone comes out. Around 95% of the people who are incarcerated right now will be released. It's around 600,000 per year. And the question is if we are not doing what we can do to help them to succeed when they transition back to society, then that isn't serving us, and it's not providing public safety. And there's more, though, to this, to this notion of mass incarceration than just these massive numbers. Incarceration accelerates and it widens the inequality gap. It does not just affect individuals, as you saw in the video. It affects 2.7 million children. It affects their communities and their families. It has tremendous ripple effects. We know that incarceration, there's a lot of research that demonstrates that incarceration depresses wages for people who have been incarcerated. It depresses the weeks worked when you compare them to someone who has not spent time in prison, and it depresses annual earnings. And so if you just imagine that as human beings that you are in this room, if you are a breadwinner, you are going to work less, your wages will be less, and the annual earnings will be less, and your family will suffer, and as a result, the communities in which you live will suffer. Part of this edifice, this infrastructure, is that it's not just about the time in prison, but it's about what we call collateral consequences, which I've always thought of as being sort of a very funny term, because it really signals sort of like an inside-out way of looking at the world. People who have been in prison are second-class citizens in this society. They are barred from certain jobs. They are often barred from voting. They are barred from housing, often public housing as well, student aid, all sorts of jobs that might be available to people that require licensing and certification are not available to folks. So when you get out, the ability to succeed, in addition to not being prepared, there are thousands of barriers that exist. So this is a construct. It's not just about someone going into prison, being punished, leaving. It is the boundaries of our system of mass incarceration are broad, and the concentric circles into society are profound. Our system of mass incarceration, I think it probably will come as no surprise to everyone in this room, disproportionately burdens poor people of color. I can throw out a few statistics that demonstrate this. Blacks make up a 12% part of the American population, but 38% of the imprisoned population. You can take it down to the neighborhood level. One of the examples that I think is really most profound is a neighborhood in Chicago called West Garfield Park. It is the neighborhood that has the highest black incarceration rate in Chicago. When you compare it to the neighborhood that has the highest white incarceration rate in Chicago, West Garfield Park's rate is 40 times that of the white neighborhood. If you are a young black boy who was born today, you have a 1 in 3 chance of spending time in jail and prison in your lifetime. That is worse than it is for Latino boys who have a 1 in 6 chance, and significantly worse than it is for white males who have a 1 in 17 chance. Someone at a recent panel mentioned a fact that I think is most striking, which is that, and I think Glenn Lowry, who was on the National Academy of Sciences panel that looked at the causes and consequences of mass incarceration, knows this well. But if you are a black high school dropout in this country, you have a 70% chance of spending time not just in jail. That doesn't mean just getting arrested and spending some time and then getting released prior to trial. You have a 70% chance by the time you were 35 of having been sent to prison. So that means being sentenced for something of a year or more. I mean, that is astonishing, and it did not always used to be that way in this country. So maybe there are some people in this room who might be thinking, well, okay, I get the racial disparities, but, is it fair to say that, this all makes sense because there are higher rates of criminality in the African American community and, poor communities of color? And the answer to that is a uncategorical no. There are, it is true, higher rates of involvement in certain crimes and between when you compare African American communities to Latino communities and to white communities. And there's a lot that gets packed into that, and you have to unpack the structural racism and the need and the concentrated poverty. But that is not a sufficient indicator of why we see the kinds of disparities we see. You have to look at the generation's deep structural racism. You have to look at disparities in treatment. Cy Vance was just giving a talk over on the other side of the campus about prosecutorial discretion and how all along the criminal justice process, from police interactions to prosecutorial decisions to judicial decisions, that disparity exists. And we did a study of Cy's office, which indicated that at every point of discretion in the system, that there was a disparity that could only be explained because of independent factors of race and ethnicity. And that's not to blame Cy Vance. He actually had the courage to look into this, which is something quite unusual for prosecutors in this country, but it is a recognition that we have implicit bias, and we carry around all sorts of biases, and there's racism that infects all of our decision making. And then, of course, when we get to the question of, well, gee, how did we even get here? You have to look at the fact that we made choices in public policy that connected criminality quite intentionally to being black. So how did we get there? How did we build this massive system? It is a result of our democracy, so congratulations, everyone. I mean, and maybe not everyone in this room, but for the past 40 years, Americans have voted to elect leaders who pursued a tough-on-crime strategy and were intentionally punitive, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, abolition of parole, things of that nature. As the National Academy of Sciences panel that Glenn was a part of, I thought delicately put it, Crime and race were sometimes conflated. You can look for a more pointed critique from Michelle Alexander's must-read The New Jim Crow, which pointed to Nixon's Southern strategy and the desire to really capitalize on white resentment about civil rights gains, and using that resentment to figure out how to engage in a white working class population and get them to focus on what was the next boogeyman, which was violence in inner cities. And so crime and blackness were connected, and that served to be, you can look at Willie Horton, you can look at any number of features of our historic discussion and know that that has been a big part of how we got to where we got. Reagan's war on drugs continued that. This has been decades long. It is not just Republicans, it is Democrats. Everyone was complicit. So are we different than other countries? The answer is yes. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the incarcerated population. For those of you who are economists and pay attention to the OECD, and I cannot even remember what that acronym stands for anymore, we incarcerate at a rate of 6 to 10 times of other OECD countries. Germany, which is perhaps one of the best examples of our peers, incarcerates at 1/10 the rate we do. And in the early 70s, we were about where they were. So we made choices. And the other thing to note is that in the early 70s, what was happening globally is that there was a rise in crime. It was not just in the United States. It wasn't in the late 60s turmoil in the United States. It was everywhere. And we chose a different course. So the question now is, how do we get out? And we're going to tackle some of this on the following panel, but I will say that we are at a new moment. There is a political consensus that has existed for a number of years that is building and growing. It is most powerfully seen in states. There is a mobilization of many voices from Black Lives Matter and grassroots organizations all around the country, but I will even say the Aspen Institute attendees. I have never seen a track at the Aspen Institute focused on crime and punishment. This is history, the fact that we are doing this and that we are tackling this. And so there is a much more durable coalition that is being built. And there is increased transparency, citizen journalism, much more attention by the media to these issues is helping people who perhaps did not pay attention, who were unable to see across the gray walls that imprison our fellow citizens, or helping them to better understand these issues and better understand what it means to have 2.2 million people who are locked up. So that's the Dime Tour. There will be no test at the end because I know we have to end this early so that everyone can hustle over to see Secretary Kerry. Thanks very much for your attention.
Two panels today. First one is, okay, we are going to do these changes, right? Police reform, sentencing reform. This country's going to turn this around. Nick ended on the right note. We're going to make these changes, and we are going to stop incarcerating so many people in this country. But turns out there are millions who are locked up. So what do we do, and what's best practice? And who are the social entrepreneurs who are out there making transformative change when folks are on the inside? And I would submit to you that we've got 3 of the very, very best right here. So this panel's we're going to talk about that, and I'm going to start with Jody in a minute. And then we'll shift and say, okay, Nick pointed out most everybody's coming out. So how do you think about that transition? How do we strengthen those who are coming back into society? How do we make sure returning citizens get access to opportunity that they deserve? They've done their time. And so the second panel after these guys will be really focused on that just got out moment, that transition moment, that connected to the justice system, but how do you really seize opportunity? So I am going to stop. I'm going to introduce these guys very quickly. Jody Lewin is the founder of the Prison University Project at San Quentin. Some of you have probably heard the NPR stories and other things, and we're going to talk to her. Max Kenner, founder of the Barred Prison Initiative. How many of you have heard of BPI? We're going to hear about Max's work at Bard, which he started as a student there. And Doug Wood is one of the most remarkable leaders in philanthropy that I know. And Doug leads the higher education portfolio for the U.S. at the Ford Foundation. We're going to hear about his work. Jody, let's start with you, please. What is this Prison University project? How did it happen? What does it look like? What do you do?
Thank you. Okay. First of all, I just want to thank Steve for doing this. This is his accomplishment largely, and I think we're all extremely grateful. The Prison University Project in a nutshell. So just some quick background. 1994, Congress passed something called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which a lot of people here are familiar with. Among many other things, that bill barred people in prison from receiving Pell Grants. And in a nutshell, that effectively wiped out most prison higher education programs around the country. At the time, in the late 80s and early 90s, a very small non-denominational Christian school called Patton College was running mostly ministry certificate classes in several different prisons in California. And they were also running a general education Associate of Arts degree program at the prison in Tracy. There was a lot of demand for that. They decided they were going to start something similar at San Quentin. And then it turned out the money was gone because the Pell money was pulled. And what ended up happening was simply that a professor at UC Davis who had intended to teach adjunct with this program heard that they were planning to call off the whole program and simply said to the folks at Patton, look, I have a day job. I'd be willing to teach for free. And the folks at Patton said, well, if you can find other faculty who'll teach without being paid, we'll go ahead and enroll the students without compensation. So while programs around the country are crashing and burning, this program got started. And they began in 1996 with 2 classes. And volunteer instructors, they just scrounged together the textbooks and the school supplies, and that program just kept growing. So I'm collapsing a lot of history, obviously, but in 96, I actually started then. I was a grad student in the rhetoric department at UC Berkeley, heard about the program, started as a teacher, and then in 99. And then in 2000, the person who had been coordinating this program as a volunteer left for another job, and there was nobody to take it over. So I then, with some colleagues, some fellow teachers at the time, ended up ultimately founding the Prison University Project, initially just as the fundraising arm of this program, because we realized, being the geniuses that we were, it would help if we had some money, finally, after all those years. And so that's what we did. And so to fast forward to today, we now have, so back then it was obviously much smaller, but today we have about 350 students currently enrolled, both in college preparatory math and English programs and in an Associate of Arts general education degree program. About 90% of our students at intake place into the college preparatory programs. They have to have a GED or a high school diploma, but almost no one is ready to do college-level work. The faculty are all still volunteers. They're mostly professors and advanced graduate students from UC Berkeley, Stanford, San Francisco State, Sonoma State, other local colleges and universities. And we just trundle along. So I would say for a very long time, we thought our main focus would simply be San Quentin and expanding that program, which it still is, but we're also becoming now more engaged in providing technical assistance to other schools that are interested in starting up programs in other prisons. And I would just, sorry, you go ahead.
Well, I want you to talk about the experience for the students. So bring your students into this room for this audience. You know, what does it mean to be able to enroll in higher education inside prison, the prison? And San Quentin, let's dispel some myths. I mean, I think probably there's a lot of urban myth about, you know, what could be, prison gangs, the whole thing. I believe you see something different. I just want you to touch on that.
Great. So, first of all, San Quentin has a reputation as a very violent maximum security prison, which it was historically. It's actually now a medium security prison and is actually one of the least violent prisons in the state of California, largely because of the presence of a lot of the education, self-help recovery programs and cultural arts and education programs that are taking place there. So first of all, the climate there is very different. But the word that students often use to describe the opportunity to be in school is transformative. And when you work in this field, and this is often sort of a point of tension, I think, between practitioners working in the field and folks working at the policy level, there's a very strong disconnect between, I think, how many of us think about and experience the work inside and how it's imagined and discussed on the outside, particularly because to me, the impact of this work, as I understand, through the eyes of students, It really is about developing one's own intellectual potential, developing as a social and emotional being, developing one's own professional abilities and expanding one's understanding of the world and what's out there, how to navigate, from a sort of the perspective of civic engagement. Education is vital, and we see a lot of students kind of engaging with the world and society at large in a totally different way as they become more educated. But it also seems to have, and students talk about this also a lot, a profoundly therapeutic impact. And I think there are days when I think we could be teaching basket weaving, and just the fact that we care as deeply about our students already, and that they're being taught by people who are brilliant and dedicated, I think matters a great deal. There's something about the experience of care in any professional environment that I think makes a huge difference. But then the added value of acquiring strong critical thinking skills, written and verbal communication, those things also affect you globally, right? When you feel that you can analyze the world around you and express yourself, I think those are the things that have a particularly powerful impact.
Thank you. That's a great segue to Max, if we can talk a little bit about Bard Prison Initiative and the sort of thirst for knowledge and the ability for someone who is locked up, literally, to transcend that through learning. Bard, you started this years ago. It really is, talk about the Bard Prison Initiative, and especially let folks know about how the curriculum works, the great books. Give us your story.
So first of all, I want to second what Jody said. We've each been at this for a long time, and as the work has become more prominent, more fashionable, we find ourselves in more places like this, but I want to thank Steve in particular, because you've been a supporter of this field for quite a while, and long before we were doing the things we are now, so
Not necessarily.
thank you very much. Just a little bit more of the background. I also said I wouldn't come if I had to follow Jody Lewin, because I know how hard that is. But just one or two things I think to emphasize in terms of the history that maybe weren't clear, or just to pull out from what Jody said. So college education, college opportunity was really a central part of American criminal punishment, right? College opportunity was in virtually every state and federal prison across the country for essentially a generation. And it was widely and overwhelmingly documented to be the most effective thing, right? And when I say effective, what do I mean? I mean reducing recidivism. People know what that means. Means increasing the likelihood of a healthy relationship between someone in prison and their family, reducing violence within an institution, increasing the likelihood of employability, reducing recidivism irrespective of employability, et cetera, did all those things radically better than anything else we did in prison, and it did it more inexpensively than anything else we were doing in prison. Drug treatment, violence, blah, 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 right? And the insertion of the ban on Pell eligibility for people in prison, right? It's embarrassing if you're Jody and me, we spend our lives fundraising to pay for these programs, but they're really horrifyingly inexpensive as compared to anything else in the landscape of criminal justice or education, right?
So Jody touched on it. Just remind people when that Pell shift happened.
So this is the peak moment. This is peak tough on crime, frenzy, and vindictiveness, excuse me. Not tough on crime, tough on criminals, right? Because we know the work that Jody does and that we do across the country decreases crime and increases public safety. But it was inserted into the Clinton crime bill, and so then for a number of years, the remnants of PUP was an exception, but by and large, we went from every prison in the country to none, right? Is that fair? Okay. So just wanted that to be really clear for everybody. It's a little bit hard. It's not just because I'm convoluted. I just want you to bear with me. The talking about our work is a little tricky because it truly happens at the juncture of two crises, two phenomena in American life that we typically think of as separate: criminal punishment and educational opportunity, right? And just talking about the criminal justice piece for a second, right? It's almost redundant. It's so tragic to think of who's in prison, right? We don't even have to say it, right? We know our enormous prison apparatus is filled with people who were sent there overwhelmingly as young men or boys of color, right? And also the populations that are overwhelmingly isolated from the best and most meaningful educational opportunities in the United States, right? And that, again, it's almost redundant. It's almost useless to say because we all know it inherently, but we have to draw it out. But I want to talk a little bit about the work, not from a criminal justice perspective, but from the position of someone who's in some semblance of leadership in higher education, right? And when we look at the landscape of the United States and all the failure in higher education, in the way we do admission, in the way we saddle students with debt, in the way that no one's really satisfied about the ways we're engaging young people in the sciences, honoring the arts, civic engagement, all the things that the liberal education does, right? When we look at the landscape across the United States, we should be thinking creatively all the ways that we can do things differently. Where can we locate students that are otherwise isolated, that otherwise aren't being convinced that this stuff matters to them, and get to work, right? When you look at what we do on a barred campus, right? We spend half of our time, 3/4 of our time, convincing students that the stuff they do there, the stuff they do with us, this happens at Brown, this happens at all the fanciest colleges and universities across the country, convincing undergraduates the things we do with them matter, right? Once they do that, irrespective of their background, their brains, what have you, they do great. And there are people throughout American history, groups of people, who've always done more with educational opportunity. Immigrants. 80 years ago, the best colleges in the United States were community colleges in Brooklyn and Queens, filled with people who weren't allowed to go to the fancier, more famous places, right? Throughout the 20th century, veterans transformed the landscape of higher education in the United States, and we never, ever talk about it, but no group of people have done more with a less educational opportunity than the generation or so of Americans who were freed from slavery, right? So when we see incarcerated students accomplish the things that they do in San Quentin and across the country, right? Our students who go from algebraic illiteracy to first, second, third term calculus and become math majors and accomplish things at the same level as barred students from Europe or Asia or the best private schools in New York or Los Angeles.
So let's just make sure we name that. You do not dumb down your curriculum one iota inside those.
So Bart, you know, we're a fancy private liberal arts college. We think very highly of ourselves. People come from all over the country to come. And the basic premise that I have, you know, with the leadership and the trustees of that institution is that we have a blank check to have full scholarships for incarcerated people. We enroll just New Yorkers. Based on the premise that what we do is of the same meaning, the same quality, the same value as what happens on campus.
Yeah.
Right? So students thrive in math. You know, students become possessed with continental philosophy or literature and decide they have to, you know, learn to read German so they can do Hegel in the original. Students go on to get terminal degrees at Yale, Columbia, NYU, et cetera. And so really at its core, you have one or two things that are worth pointing out. BPI is simply an experiment of what happens when you provide the kind of education that we think only really is somehow relevant to the children of the rich or the lucky or the entitled, to others, right? And how do we as leaders in education look in the pockets of the United States to make sure that we're engaging Americans who will make the most of that opportunity, not the ones who we think will most predictably end up there on their own.
Yeah, and I had the great privilege to visit BPI. If you ever have a chance, check it out. I can testify that I was at a loss when sitting with a group of students, some who had to apply multiple years to get in, and one young man was working on his thesis and said, I know I'm doing Kant, I know I'm doing Heidegger, and I can't decide between Hume and Freud. What do you think? And I said, dude, I just picked up the latest issue of Rolling Stone magazine. I got like, I am sorry, I cannot help you. And just to we talked yesterday, we ran into each other on campus. You corrected me on a couple of things. It was great. And Max, you've got the debate. Let's just touch on that. You've got a debate team. The debate team battles against outside institutions. There's a story there. We're hoping Scott Budnick wins the movie rights, but I know there's a battle going on for that. Tell the story just briefly, because this is about talent being equally distributed across our country and opportunity not. And you said it's also about some other things, but tell that very quickly.
So very quickly, our students, we have about 300 students incarcerated in New York at any given moment. They spend most of their time going to college, and we try to replicate the college life as much as possible. There are a handful of extracurricular things that happen. A debate team is one of them. That came from student initiatives, student interest, people are interested in rhetoric, what have you. So we started a number of years ago bringing in outside institutions, other teams to compete. We started with the West Point Academy. The cadets come every spring and compete, and that's great, that's fun, they're incredible. And then, it started to be a regular thing, and we did well, which I don't know if it surprised us, but it was not, winning's better than losing, I guess, some of the time. And then it sort of happened that Harvard became the national champion, I guess, a year and a half ago, and so our students wanted to invite them to come, so we did, and they came, and they lost, we won, and it was, we were really naive to, how much America really just enjoys, an institution with the strength of the brand that they have losing,
Yeah.
It took about 2 weeks, but it became, according to Google, I think the 9th largest story in the world last year. And there was no information because we didn't let anything out. It was just a headline. But there were one or two things that I think, and I'd love to hear Jody's response, that were really interesting about it, right? Because we've been at this a long time, and for a lot of that time, we almost had to do the work in secret because a lot of people believe that what we do is wrong, right? And that's worth remembering. It's hard for us to forget. But the experience with Harvard did two things, right? It changed people's minds about our work in ways that I think people so often assume in America. When we talk about being inclusive, they immediately jump to the conclusion that we're dumbing standards down.
Right.
And when you could just say, these guys in prison beat Harvard, you knew instantly that that wasn't what was happening, right? And when we talk about being, increasing access, they think you're excluding someone else, right? And so the idea that these guys were working as hard as they were and the accomplishments were real kind of changed the way people dealt with us in a way that was really, I think, a cause for optimism and instructive in how we talk about it moving forward.
Jody, you want to add something quick, and then we'll go to Doug.
Just really quickly to call out a couple more, or sort of pull up a couple more points from what Max just said. One of the things that's revealed in the public reaction to the debate win was that the low expectations people have of the intellectual potential of people in prison, right? And so in a way, that was only surprising or funny because people don't expect that to be possible. Whereas for those folks who have worked inside or lived inside, like, hello, like, why is that funny? Why is that surprising, right? So, I think that those types of things give us a glimpse into a larger issue, which is the really profound negative stereotypes that people have about people who are incarcerated. And I would just add that I think a really important context for this entire field is the vilification, the demonization, the degradation of people in prison that allows the system to exist as it does. And so I think that part of what's valuable about programs inside is that they confront us as a society with some of those negative expectations and allows for opportunities to overcome them. And I would also just add that to a large extent, a lot of I have found increasingly that really one of the most important things we are actually doing is transforming the way the public thinks about people in prison and specifically humanizing people in prison. So I would say if we accomplish nothing else, if we allow people to really grasp the humanity of people who are inside, that we will have done our work.
Yeah. Let's turn to Doug. Doug is much more than just the check writer for all of this effort, and I think in a lot of ways, when Doug came to Ford, he saw some momentum that many of us didn't see. I was working in philanthropy at the time and took a big risk and positioned his role at Ford in leading the post-secondary portfolio there around addressing the inequity in our justice system, addressing education for those who are both locked up and those who are returning. And so I guess my first question is, and foundations should be the big risk takers, right? And we often in philanthropy say, oh, this is the risk capital where, and frankly, it's just not true. The more organized a philanthropy, the less risky I see them being often. And so Doug, how the hell did you do this at Ford and create a whole portfolio of work around this population and those who are returning? Tell us a little bit of that story.
Okay, well, first of all, let me say it's great that you're invited us here, and I want to thank you. You've been a great partner and colleague throughout this entire time from the very beginning, so I want to acknowledge that. And I'd also like to say, if you thought it was hard to follow Jody, I had to follow Nick, Jody, and you. So, but it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be on the stage with my colleagues here. So just quickly, when I came to Ford 5 years ago, I was asked by our then Vice President, Darren Walker, who is our fabulous president now, to rethink our higher education strategy. And he gave me a lot of latitude to do that. And so I, first of all, started with the Ford Archives, because many of us know that Ford is a social justice foundation, and some of you know that I love history, and I really wanted to get a sense of what our investments have been at the foundation in higher education. And so back then, we actually had our archives within the foundation. And so as I was rummaging through materials, things like a grant to Martin Luther King and SNCC, and a letter for Kofi Annan to get a Ford Fellowship at Macalester College. I also came across this great memo from Christopher Edley Sr., who in 1967 suggested that the Ford Foundation fund college and prison programs because he was very prescient about what was going on in inner cities and actually predicted mass incarceration as we know it today. And so at that time, we didn't have Pell Grants, but when individuals in prison had the opportunity to leverage dollars in the Pell Grant, we stopped funding the program. So interestingly enough, we're coming back at full circle in many ways. So we actually had a brain trust to come to Ford, including Jody and Max and Vivian and many of these thought leaders, to figure out how could we really craft a strategy in this area. Also had a chance to interview 326 people across the country. And I hate telling this story, Vivian knows this story, but I visited 10 prisons initially, interviewing people who had high quality programs like BPI, also Prison University Project, and people who didn't have opportunities as well. And I had a phone conversation with my mother, and she said, Douglas, this is great. How many women's prisons have you visited? And it was crickets on my side, and I felt very embarrassed. And she said, well, I think you should visit women's prisons as well, because I think you'll find that the experiences of women in prison is very different than those of men. And so then I went out to 10 women's prisons. And so ultimately what happened with all that work, we decided that we have a strategy based on 4 different objectives. One is that we fund high quality programs like BPI and Prison University Project and College and Community Fellowship. And if you're a philanthropist out there, these were not project-based grants, they were core support and general support grants. So if you don't know the difference between that, I'm sure they can tell you there's a big difference. Really building the capacity of those organizations and really trying to also support communities of practice. Number 2, to focus on systemic change. So we partnered with the Vera Institute of Justice and the Gates Foundation when Steve was there, and several other foundations to help launch the Vera Pathways from Prison to Post-Secondary Education and Reentry Project, which was a statewide focus. We've also done that in California most recently, and at the same time working with grantees and partners to really continually put the focus on the second chance possibilities. Third was to change the dominant cultural narrative and help change the public discourse. So we've partnered with our Just Films documentary unit over the last several years. We have 6 films either completed in pre-production, production, and post-production, 2 of which won the 2 highest awards at the Tribeca Film Festival this year. If you've not seen Do Not Resist, see it. It's about the militarization of police and policing in America. And the second one, The Return, which talks about the challenges and barriers people face when they get out. And I want to emphasize something Jody said, and it's really about the humanization of people. And we really want to try to leverage the voices of people who are most affected. So for example, we fund Just Leadership with Glenn Martin, who's not here, but he's a great leader in this work. But in addition to that, we also fund research, just like the Justice and Poverty Project with Bruce Western and Matt. And a lot of that work helped Matt to do his research around the great book Evicted, which talks about housing as a platform and its relationship to educational attainment, health, et cetera, especially when you're thinking about the spatial concentrations of high rates of incarceration, its impact on women's health, on educational attainment, on economic security. And then finally, also in books. So we've got a great series of books with the New Press, and one of the ones that just came out is Monique Mao's great book titled Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in America, which is a great book. And so it started a dialogue, a public discourse. And then finally, the 4th objective was to expand the donor pool. As Jody and Max just said, I mean, they're operating these high-quality programs on a shoestring budget. And so we needed to try to bring in more federal dollars as well as state dollars and private dollars. And so we've been able to do that, and now we've reached, when you add in the Second Chance Pell, when you add in 17 foundations that's been involved in this, when you add in the jointly funded projects that we've done with states, we've leveraged about a little over $100 million over the last 5 years for this work.
Brilliant. We're almost out of time, but I don't want to bury the lead on Second Chance Pell, and so there is a great, and I give you a lot of credit, Doug, for the financing and the thinking and the strategy and the partnership with Vera and others. Just talk a little bit about where we are with Pell right now in real time in our country.
I mean, first of all, I'll say that this could not be, it would not have happened without the years and years and years of work by people like Vivian and Jody and Max, really leading the way for this work, and people like Scott Butnick at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. And so what's exciting about it is that under the experimental rules, under the Higher Education Act of the U.S. Secretary of Education, who has the ability to do this, the Obama administration has announced the Second Chance Pell Grants, which is an experimental program to allow funding for college and prison based on high quality and accountability. So what I want everybody to understand is that you had over 200 colleges and universities apply, representing 48 states. And last Friday, they just announced it, and so 67 colleges and universities across the country, representing 28 states, will receive funding. And what I want to say about that is that it seems to me that that's an indication out there that there is, in fact, a groundswell that we need to tap. And it's thanks to all the work of everyone here that I think we can move the needle on this. And I think for our next big goal, we've talked about big ideas, we're at Aspen Ideas, so let's throw out a big idea. Let's overturn the Pell Grant ban on college and prison in the United States. So.
We're going to have to leave it there with this incredible panel, a series of solutions for the educational needs and the opportunity in prison related to education. Thank you all. We're going to now transition to our next panel, and Doug has teed up my first question for Vivian Nixon perfectly. And you all stick around, because when we do Q&A, there'll be an opportunity to ask these guys questions if you have them. Thank you again to this panel. Next panel, please come on up. So as these guys come up, thank you, everybody. Let me just ask you all, one of the data points I'm not sure Nick hit on is roughly nearly 70 million Americans have some kind of criminal record. That's kind of a staggering number, nearly 70 million. So how many of you actually know someone who's, or is someone? That was the rest of it. How many of you know someone or have yourself a criminal record? That's staggering. We're at Aspen Ideas Festival. Nobody here is supposed to get arrested. You're supposed to, half the room at least, half the room. So from Nick's point earlier, yes, we're going to reform policing. We're going to change sentencing laws. We're going to get rid of mandatory minimums. This stuff is happening. Policy change is happening. We also know that there are best-in-class providers who are providing educational opportunity and breaking the intergenerational transmission of poverty through programs like what Jody leads and Bard Prison Initiative. But we got a whole lot of folk with records who need access to opportunity, and we have a lot of work to do in this space. Thankfully, we have 4 of the most significant thought leaders and frankly, best-in-class partners in this work to help us talk about this. So I'm just going to quickly introduce these guys, and then we're going to jump in. So starting with Marcus Bullock, who is the CEO of Flick Shop and started a construction company when he first came out. And Marcus, I'm going to let you tell more about that in a minute. The Reverend Vivian Nixon, who Reverend Rapping Vivian Nixon, if you were in the earlier session, who has done so much in this work and is the CEO of the College and Community Fellowship Program. Is CEO the executive director? Executive director. Scott Budnick, and some of you are wondering, like, why is the producer of the Hangover movies on a panel about post-incarceration support? And I know some of you are thinking, well, that Hangover 3 was some kind of, at least a misdemeanor offense or something like that. But that's not it. One of the most committed, dedicated activists, founder of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition in Los Angeles, California, Scott Budnick.
That was really cute.
Thanks, Scott. I told you I was going to do that. And Piper Kerman, who is no stranger to you all because of her best-selling book, Orange is the New Black. Woo! What you don't know about Piper is, really what she enjoys the most is going back in and teaching writing inside the system. So I've already overdone the introductions. Vivian, I want to start with you because when I was at Gates and Doug was working on his new portfolio, we had a round table at the Soros Open Society Foundations with a bunch of activists, and you were across the room from me. And you were saying, we got to restore Pell. We can do this. And I think the person to my immediate right who was also active is like, yeah, good luck with that. Yeah, and maybe gays will be able to legally get married someday too. So we're halfway there. So I want you to talk about your program and your work, but I want to give you a chance to just say something about what Pell means for you. And you've been really active on that, and you tilted at those windmills, and the windmills are coming down. So will you start with that, and then we'll talk about your program?
Sure. I was released from prison in 2001, and from 1997 until 2001, I was in a prison, stuck without any available opportunity to improve myself. I already had a high school diploma, so I spent my time tutoring other women, helping them get at least high school equivalency level and basic reading and math. And it was at that time that I realized how important education was to me and how much I did want to eventually go to college and graduate. When I was released from prison, I found the College and Community Fellowship as a community of other formerly incarcerated women who wanted to also go to college, and it was a very small program at the time. I was one of the first cohorts of graduates. As that organization grew, we as students who were formerly incarcerated began to understand that we needed to have a bigger impact. There were 10 or 15 of us in the program at the time, and we were like, people who are still in prison need to have this opportunity restored to them. So we began to start having that conversation, and everywhere I went, I mean everywhere, in where the conversation was not welcome and where I was literally laughed out of the room at times when I said that we need to focus both in prison and post-prison on access to educational opportunities, because it really is a game changer in our current society. And after years and years of getting laughed off of stages and getting told it's impossible and having people kind of just tolerate that idea, it started to gain a little traction as the whole criminal justice reform movement gained traction. And so I'm really happy that I stuck in there and other colleagues stuck in there with me. But I also understand that not everybody's happy about this.
And is that because of the quality question more than anything else?
It's because of the quality question,
sure.
but doing the work that I do, here's how my perspective on the work. I'm not coming at this from the perspective of an elite educational institution that wants to prove that we're the best at making people smart and intellectual. That's not the perspective I have. What I'm about is providing opportunity who have long been left out of multiple opportunities across the board. And whether that's high quality, elite liberal arts education or community college education or vocational education, if that's what a person wants to pursue, they need to have access in order to move forward with their lives and attain economic security, become civically engaged in our society. There are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who graduated from community colleges, state universities, city universities, black universities like Howard and Spelman and Morehouse, and have done tremendous things, as good as anybody from Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, or anywhere else. And so I just...
That's right.
I just want to, broaden the conversation, and Pell Grants does that.
Yeah, and we know now in today's economy, a post-secondary credential, even just 1 year of college, lifts people out of poverty.
Absolutely.
And that's the new high school diploma. So tell us just briefly, what does your organization do? And let's invite everybody to your next graduation, because I can't wait to come to one sometime, the most powerful things ever. But just very quickly.
Sure. College and Community Fellowship is an organization that helps women coming out of the justice system to get ready for, apply to, and succeed in college. The way we do that is by providing 3 core things: personal, individual academic counseling and mentoring, financial aid and financial capability counseling, and a community environment where women who do very well in community and in relationships support each other and educate each other. Our alumni are incredibly involved in mentorship to get to the finish line of accomplishing a college degree. And in a society where college completion is a mystery in most community colleges, we have more than a 75% graduation rate of everybody who walks in our doors and signs.
That's right. Wow. That's right.
I wish we could go deep on all the barriers and why isn't this common practice for returning citizens, and we'll hold that. I want to just pivot to Marcus quickly. First of all, you and I had a chance to have a beer the other night, maybe 2, and I don't think I've ever met somebody. You are a natural-born entrepreneur, and I just wish you would share a little bit about your own pathway. We've got post-secondary first, we've got work first. The dignity of work when a returning citizen returns. What does it look like for you? Tell us about your work, Marcus.
Thank you so much. The beer was good too. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
More importantly, thank you for buying.
So we charge that to the Ford Foundation.
Doug, I owe you one the next time. So what we're able to do with Flick Shop is we're able to connect families in a way that hasn't been done before in prisons, and I'm really, really excited.
I apologize. You're going to talk about Flick Shop.
Yeah,
good.
But I want to talk to connect that.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I apologize.
Oh no. The importance of the work is what I'm hearing from you. The importance of the work. So the education piece is obviously vital, and then the employment piece is just as critical.
Just go there with Flick Shop. Ignore me. Go there.
Okay. All right, cool. Don't cut me off again.
All right. I won't.
So we created Flick Shop to be able to create a bridge for the family, but understanding that the need for obviously education and employment were cornerstones of the pillars of success for those who come home from prison. And so, wow, I applaud you, one, for the work that you guys are doing on that side. Our focus has been more about trying to figure out ways to connect guys to employment and as well as entrepreneurship. And so we created the Flick Shop School of Business to be able to do that. We use our technology platform that we created, and it's now connecting families all over the country to be able to break the barrier so that it doesn't seem as taboo now when we start talking about some of those other barriers that we didn't get the opportunity to talk about, and especially introducing that into the employment circuit.
Yeah, and so what I was touching on is you previously started a construction company that also hired formerly incarcerated returning citizens. Just tell folks in a very short summary, what is Flick Shop? Because it is brilliant, and what problem does it solve?
Thank you. So Flick Shop is a mobile app. It's free in the Apple and Android stores. This is the only part of the talk where I won't be angry if anyone looks down at their phones because I'm assuming that you're downloading the Flick Shop mobile app. But it allows our users to be able to take a picture, add some quick text, press send, and for 99 cents, we send a real tangible photo postcard directly to any person in any prison anywhere in the country. We were adamant about keeping the family connected because when I was in prison, people asked me what was the thing that allowed me to be able to pivot and go in a direction that most don't have an opportunity to be able to do. And it's definitely family for me. It was family, and then in partnering with other organizations and learning about the work that they're doing so that I can be able to use them as a real resource. It's a very big obstacle for the guys that are in prison, even in coming home. And trying to even locate the resource, one, and then two, being able to communicate effectively with the community that they've been gone from for so long, so that they can actually ascertain some of those resources, especially when we talk about employment. And yes, when I first came home, it was a big problem for me gaining employment. So I found the first job that I could find was a paint store job. I was the guy that was mixing paint behind the register, and people would come in and they would say, well, how much does it cost for you to paint my kitchen? I'm like, well, we don't paint kitchens, we sell you the paint so that you can paint your kitchen. What color blue you want? And then at the same time, some of the painters and other contractors would come into the paint store and they would say, oh man, it's really hard out here. It's hard to find work. It's a real estate bubble. It just burst. And so now it's no work for us. And I'm like, well, Ms. Johnson just came in asking about. And so it birthed Perspectives Painting Contractors, where I became the conduit between those families. And I took the path of entrepreneurship because while 12 years later now I'm telling that story, in the beginning it was very challenging and most won't have that opportunity that I did to even have a platform as the paint store, that's Soapbox from the paint store. So.
Thank you for that. And grab him afterwards and have him tell you the story of the entrepreneurship of his work inside prison, where in a nutshell, he was able to create an alternative commissary such that he helped buy his mother a home while incarcerated. Unbelievable.
Can I just, Marcus, I feel like you're being very modest.
Yeah.
What happened this morning, Mark?
Yeah, can you just say that? Great, thank you, Piper.
Thank you.
What happened this morning?
We pitched at the Aspen Ideas Award, and we were the winners.
All right, the moderator's not supposed to get choked up. Scott Budnick, you've changed your whole life around these issues. One of the most successful producers in Hollywood. You're now launching a production company that's focused on bringing these issues to the forefront and others. And you founded the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. In fact, I think based on going in and volunteering, can you just talk about the pathway that brought you to ARC, and what is ARC, and what are you doing at ARC?
Sure, absolutely. Steve, thanks a lot. An incredible panel we have here. So I made a bunch of incredibly mature films, but when I was on the set of Old School, I met a producer that invited me down to Juvenile Hall in Los Angeles, and I came in and I walked into Juvenile Hall for my first time to be a guest speaker in a creative writing program called Inside Out Writers. And I sat down at a table with 14, 15, 16-year-olds in Juvenile Hall. And it was just shocking what I found out. The kid to the left of me, David, had just been sentenced to 300 years in prison at 15 years old for standing next to somebody that shot the victim in the rear end. So standing next to someone, not touching the weapon, he was going to prison for 300 years. And the kid on the other side of me, named Adam, looked like he was 11 years old, and he was just sentenced to prison for 6 years for a robbery, and he was heading into the adult prison system. And as I heard their stories, and it was a creative writing program, and you learn a bit about their stories, you can imagine David, who had experienced foster care, who had experienced physical and sexual abuse, who had experienced extreme neglect and abuse from every adult that you expected to be there in his life. And if you don't have that, you hang out with the wrong people, you look for love in all the wrong places, and you find yourself sitting in juvenile hall at 15 years old. And how does a 15-year-old rationalize after being through everything we wouldn't wish on our worst enemy? How does a 15-year-old now rationalize that he's going away for 300 years for standing somewhere? So that day was insanely transformative for me. As you can imagine, you're hearing the story. I'm sitting next to him and hearing these stories. And it sent me on a path that I started teaching that class every Saturday morning. I still, 15 years later, teach that class every Saturday morning. And I've met unbelievable kids that have made unbelievably bad mistakes and done bad things. But I realize that every kid has the ability to change, and that all of these kids that I work with have the ability to change. And I've seen so many of them go on to do incredible things, like the folks we have here on the stage today. So it sent me into the prison system. I actually started working in prison college programs and trying to create a pipeline to expand those programs so my kids could go somewhere and be safe. And I followed David and I followed Adam into prison, and I stayed in their lives, and ended up having a student named Prophet Walker, who was arrested at 16, was my student in juvenile hall, went to prison, got his AA degree, got accepted into the Loyola Marymount School of Science and Engineering while he was still in his prison clothes in the dorm, which then motivated everyone else in the prison college program to strive to go to a 4-year university. And then Prophet got out. He ran for state assembly. He was making $120 an hour 2 months after getting out of prison, building a hospital in Santa Monica. And that's just one of the unbelievable examples that we have of folks that have gone in the system and come out and didn't allow the system to break them, allowed it to make them, but the system didn't make them, they made themselves.
Yes.
With the help of adults, with the help of people that care. So we started bringing all those young people together, 18 to 25-year-olds, as they were coming out of prison. We started doing retreats, we did camping trips, and we just started a support group. And we were able to advocate for a bill in the California legislature. SB 9 was to end life without parole for juveniles in California. Mind you, we're the only country in the world other than Somalia that sentences a kid to die in prison. The land of the free, the United States of America. And for 7 years, this bill couldn't get passed. 0 Republicans, 12 Democrats wouldn't vote for the bill. And in one day of coming up with Prophet and others who had been formerly incarcerated, going into the Capitol, suit, coat and tie, looking sharp, telling their story, this is who I was, this is how I changed, this is what I'm doing now, and one day we passed the bill, governor signed into law. And kids can't get life without parole. So since then, we formed ARC. It's an organization of today 320 formerly incarcerated men and women, many who have gone through the juvenile justice system and been incarcerated as youth, and some got out after 2 years and they're 19 years old, and some got out after 30 years and they're 45 years old. And the whole purpose of the organization is to help them when they get out through housing, through mentoring, through a support group of the formerly incarcerated, through job training, through jobs, through union jobs, through businesses that hire our folks, through therapy and everything else, to empower them to be advocates, to then go to Sacramento and go to Washington, D.C. to change policies. And I'm happy to say that since SB 9, we've passed 6 more laws that the governor signed, giving 19,000 young people who would have died in prison the chance to come home. And David, who was sitting next to me in that class, who had 300 years, now gets a chance to go to the parole board in 5 years because of the laws that our members have passed. And Adam, who was sitting on the other side of me, was actually got out and became my prop assistant on The Hangover and worked so hard and showed up 30 minutes early every day and out-hustled everyone else that he got into the union and went from hangover to Iron Man and now makes about $125,000 a year. He's raising his kids the right way. He's got his 3 other brothers into the motion pictures unions. They've lifted their whole family out of poverty. They bought a house for their parents. And you can see what an asset. 4 kids now paying taxes, giving back, not taking, and all it took was a bunch of people to believe in them and to mentor them and to be there for them. So that's what we do at ARC. And every day, let me tell you, I used to sit at Warner Brothers and deal with a lot of people who are much greater criminals than the ones I deal with in juvenile hall. and every day, and I'll leave you with this, one little story. We went up to Pelican Bay, which is where we have solitary confinement, to meet with the people who qualify for the juvenile parole bill. And I met a man who was 60 years old and had been in solitary confinement for 30 years. And he qualified for the juvenile parole bill. He got incarcerated as a juvenile. And we did a little pinky shake through his door. There was a little hole. And he said, "You're the first human being I've touched in 30 years. Wow. And next to him was a kid named Ruben Beretta, who said to me, "I'm getting out of the SHU and being released straight back to LA. I came in at 15 years old. I have nothing. I don't know anything. I've never had a resume. I've never had a job. Could you please help me?" Ruben came out. He showed up to our office. He worked his butt off. He's now our policy intern. He's getting paid, and now we're going to hire him as full-time staff. So to sit in an office, not at Warner Brothers, and sit around these incredible people day after day, it's the most inspiring thing that's ever happened in my life. Thank you.
How the hell am I going to segue this to Piper? The SHU, I think the SHU is a theme, and Orange is the New Black. Really, we need to reform solitary confinement as amongst the many other reforms that we've talked about. But why don't I give you a chance to reflect on what you've heard, Piper? I want to acknowledge that Nick pointed out that we're at Aspen Ideas talking about justice reform, talking about ending mass incarceration in America. That reflects a moment. I think you've done as much as anyone to mainstream these issues, so I want to acknowledge you for that and thank you for that. And then maybe, if you wouldn't mind reflecting on what you've heard so far, you don't have to talk about the SHU, and just, bring it. Thank you.
Here's the thing about solitary confinement, which is, vastly used, overused, abused in American prisons and jails. It's simply a metaphor for incarceration itself. The solitary unit is just the prison within the prison, and the prison is the place that we send people who are, for some reason, not welcome in our community, and generally already pushed to the margins here in the community, and then something happens and we push them even further, first to a prison and then potentially even to the belly of the beast, which is solitary confinement. So metaphorically and practically, that's what solitary confinement is. It's just American harsh punishment pushed to the furthest extent other than the penalty of death. So
tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now, going back in, if you wouldn't mind.
Actually, it's interesting. I walked the SHU unit in the men's prison that I work in because the warden is the kind of warden who is like, sure, you can come in the SHU with me, you can come do rounds with me. And so the good news is that through the work of, the tireless work of all kinds of advocates and some thoughtful-minded people who work in corrections and law enforcement, we are seeing improvement. And so what I saw when I was in that SHU unit was some guys who were on 23-hour lockdown who had been in there for months in some cases, but the majority of that unit now doing something called limited privilege housing, which basically equals more time out of cell, the opportunity to go to meals by themselves, the opportunity to go to education, some other programming. So that's some good news. I chose to write my book, which was published in 2010, because I believe very passionately, after my own personal experience as someone who committed a crime, as somebody who was tried and convicted, as someone who was punished with prison, that if people who had perhaps been fortunate enough never to set foot in a courtroom or a jail or a prison were able to put themselves in my shoes or in the shoes of one of the other women who are depicted in that book, that they might think differently about prison and about jail. And now the The most important thing I do is I go into these 2 state prisons, a men's and a women's, and I teach nonfiction writing because my students' stories are tremendous. They're tremendously interesting, instructive, entertaining, heartbreaking, life-affirming. And my students deserve the opportunity to tell their stories, and they deserve the opportunity to gain skills to better tell their stories. And that's true whether you want to write prose, or whether you want to make films, or whether you want to, make businesses. And prisons and jails are filled with entrepreneurs, and they're filled with intellectually inquisitive, curious, and audacious people. Who need those opportunities, and most of whom, unlike me, didn't have any opportunities to get those things that feed us and grow us into the people that we're most capable of being. And the thing that is so important to me, the thing I knew before I even wrote my book, is that absent the voice of the people who are closest to this problem of mass incarceration, as Glenn Martin says, the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Our friend Glenn Martin leads Just Leadership USA, which is a fellowship program and a leadership program for formerly incarcerated people. And so that's true. People who are incarcerated now, people who have been incarcerated, their children, their parents, their communities, are the people who must be most central to figuring out how to get ourselves out of this place we have built over the last 40 years, this vast carceral state of mass incarceration. And that's why I'm so thrilled that, that Vivian is up here, that Marcus is up here, that Dwayne Betts is here, that there's so many people here at Aspen Ideas who have survived the criminal justice system and gone on to achieve the things that we're capable of.
Scott, you want to weigh in on that really quickly?
Yeah, I just want to say it's so nice talking to a crowd, so much of whom I don't even recognize.
Right.
And I want everyone in the room to understand that the evidence shows that the one thing that transforms a life more than anything you can do is to have one person in your life that cares about you and that's there for you, and it's just a sounding board for you in moments of crisis. And everyone in this room, if you're wondering how do you fit into this, is there a role for you to play? I mean, Michael Stubbs is the chair of my board. Michael, raise your hand. 5 years ago, Michael wasn't involved in these issues, and he's really set our entire board on fire and our entire organization on fire. Doug Wood, who's our largest national funder, thank you, Doug Wood, said he was able to galvanize individuals and foundations and governments to take their couple $1 million and make it $100 million to serve inside. So, I mean, the funding is so crucial. Adam Foss, raise your hand. Adam Foss, former prosecutor, now leading the Prosecutors Integrity Unit. Just when you go out and vote, the voting for your DA, the story of David Negretti, he got 300 years because a district attorney thought it was appropriate with no checks and balances to send him to prison at 15 years old for 300 years for standing next to somebody. That was a choice. And that's an elected district attorney. So very simply, if we don't like those sort of things happening, we could kick that person out of office.
So
literally, if everyone used their power, their mentorship, even in the facilities I work in, we have a grandparents program where kids that don't have parents, grandparents come in to be their grandparents. These are the things you could do to get involved. Sorry, Steve.
Thank you, Scott. No, it's okay. We're pretty close to time. There are a couple things. I only recently met Marcus, but I did a terrible job of introducing him, so I don't want to take away the last word from him. And I learned a long time ago that you do not end a panel without giving Vivian Nixon a chance to say something. And if they want to pass, that's okay. But would you two just weigh in with some final thoughts? We're going to not be able to do the Q&A. I apologize for that, but we had to give up 10 minutes because of the change in schedule. Marcus, any final thoughts you want to?
I'll be very brief, and I'll piggyback off of the last thing you said, the things that you can do, the action items that you guys can do. And I'll be honest, I'm not shy about saying, hey, get involved, and if you need someone to help you get involved, talk to me. I'm raising money to be able to fund Flickshop so that I don't have to organically continue to do it out of my own pocket. And before today, before these moments like these, it was always taboo for me even to talk about not only my incarceration, But even again, how I'm reaching back inside of those spaces to pull some of those guys back with me. One, by helping connect them with their families, but two, also helping to offer some of those reentry efforts that will allow them to be able to come home and be successful.
Thank you, brother.
Just one final sentence. I really think that we need to begin to think about people in prison and people who have criminal justice histories just as people who have the same dreams and aspirations as everybody else, and they are also capable of making their own decisions about what choices they want to make, whether it's regarding work or education or anything else. Our job is not to impose what we think is best for them on them, but to give them access to opportunity so that they can live the lives that they choose for themselves.
So, in conclusion, what Piper points out from how she teaches inside the prison, what Scott talked about in relationship to these as our kids, see the humanity in these young people, what these folks work on here, what Jody does in San Quentin, what Max does with the Barred Prison Initiative, what Doug has seeded across the country. This is about people being protagonists in their own narrative and getting the support they need to have that opportunity. And I can't say enough about our fellow panelists and about the work that's happening that's going to transform incarceration in our country. Thank you to these guys. Questions, grab Doug, grab Jody, grab Max. Don't grab Nick because he had to catch a flight. Thank you, guys.